with a story. I hinted at it in my first lecture. A true story, and Jessie is her real name. So I met Jessie a few years back. Actually, it's going probably 6 years back now. Jessie has a remarkable story, which she told to me in a couple of settings, once over a coffee at Starbucks, and then again in my living room with my wife and her and a friend of hers. So Jessie's story is as follows. She grew up in a nominally Christian home, kind of went to church once in a while, but not a regular attender, knew generally about Jesus and God, and so on. When she got to grade 12, she started having this sense, or had developed a sense, and come to the conclusion that she was actually a boy trapped in a girl's body. And she actually had a girlfriend, so she was starting to live in a lesbian relationship, and so after grade 12, she moved out of her home right away and moved in with her girlfriend, who was older than her and a nurse. And Jessie's experience was that she went to see a doctor. It was just 2 half-hour meetings, that was it, and the doctor prescribed opposite-sex hormones for her, testosterone. And Jessie said her girlfriend, who was a nurse, would do the injections for her. Once a week, every week, injections of testosterone. And around this same time, Jessie's having like a renewal of faith, which might strike you as odd, that you're both transitioning to the opposite gender and starting to get much more interested in Christianity at the same time. And so she and her girlfriend start attending the Met. So if you're familiar with Ottawa, the Met is like the mega church in Ottawa. It's a really big church, but it's a good Bible-believing church. Like, it's part of the Gospel Coalition Network and so on. So they start attending there, and like Jessie's pretty on fire. Like, she's really excited about being a new Christian, and so she goes right away to the children's ministry, and she talks to this children's ministry advisor and says, I want to be involved. I'm going to help with your children's ministry and so on. But it's clear that she's living in this lesbian relationship with her girlfriend, and she's dressing really butch, if I can put it that way. She's cropped her hair, and she's presenting as male, but still at this point clearly female. So the children's ministry leader, a woman in her 60s, she sits Jessie down. It's like, look, Jessie, first of all, if you're going to be a leader within the ministry, you got to be a member of the church here, and it's got to go through discipleship courses and so on. We got to make sure that that's happening. And there's some concerns that we have, like, do you know what it means to follow Jesus? Do you know what it means to put your own wants and desires, to put those to death and live for Christ? So Jessie was actually really, really offended by this ministry leader, and walked out in a huff, and her girlfriend left, and were like, not going to go to that church ever again. And so for about 6 months, she wasn't going to church, but the hormone injections were continuing. Okay, for 6 months. After about 6 months, Jessie's like, no, I want to go back to church. I want to do this church thing. But by now, she presents very much like a male. And so they end up going to Le Chemin, which is a Pentecostal church right behind where my house used to be in Gatineau, Quebec. Le Chemin is French for the way or the road. And so they start attending that church, and to all appearances within the church, it's like, oh, there's a boyfriend and girlfriend are attending our church. And so they go there. They're there for about another half year, and they attend. They're not super involved, but they go regularly to church. And about 6 months later, so this is a year after she began her transition, Jessie has a dream. This is how she tells me the story. So I'm just relaying her story to you. Jessie has a dream, and in the dream, the Lord tells her that she needs to embrace her female identity and to put away these delusions of trying to be a man. Be who I created you to be, is the way God speaks to her in her dream. So she wakes up from that dream and is completely transformed. She goes into her closet. She throws out a bunch of her boyish clothes and so on. She puts on a dress for the first time in years, and then realizes, like, oh boy, I have to call my girlfriend, and who is on a business trip up to Quebec City. I have to call my girlfriend and tell her that I need to break up with her because we're not living the way God would have us live. This has all got to change. So she calls her up. She calls up her girlfriend. She says, hey, I have something really hard to tell you, but God visited me in a dream, and this is what he told me, and I think you and I have to end our relationship. And her girlfriend said, yes, I know, I was expecting your call. I had the same dream last night. So, and they're sitting in my living room side by side. They're telling me this story. It's pretty remarkable. And so they do that. So they're still friends, and they still hang out as friends and so on. But they've ended their sexual relationship. And Jessie she stopped the hormone treatments, and she's starting to detransition. So when we met with her, she had stopped the hormone treatments for, it had been close to a year already. So she said, the way she explained it, it's like, well, when I stopped with the treatments, then I started praying like crazy that the Lord would heal my body because it had been already quite changed by the hormone injections. So like she had bulked up, she had way more muscle mass, her breasts had shrunk, she had stopped menstruating, she had facial hair, so very big changes to her body. Which would make you wonder, right? Like, why aren't there more warning labels with these opposite sex hormone injections? We shouldn't be experimenting with people with these, but anyway. So she started praying that the Lord would heal her body. And slowly but surely, like her muscle mass shrank, her breasts started to recover. She said about 3 months or 4 months after stopping the injections, her menstrual cycle came back and she started crying with joy because of it. She said, probably the only woman you'll ever meet that has ever cried with joy about getting her period, but that's what it was for her because, that was part of her womanhood that had been stopped because of the injections. And the other thing she kept praying for, and when she met with us, had not yet been healed and probably won't be healed, but was that her vocal cords would come back or would be healed because the testosterone had done damage to her vocal cords so that she spoke much lower and huskier than she used to. And she actually played us a video, my wife and I, she played a video of her singing before she had started doing the injections. And she had a beautiful feminine singing voice, and that was destroyed by the injections. So she's not sure if the Lord would heal her vocal cords, but she said maybe that's just a reminder for me for the rest of my life that about all of this. The last part of the story, which I think is actually probably the most beautiful part of the story, is that a few months later, then she, after she had her conversion, she actually went back to the Met, and she went back to the woman that she had talked to and was so offended by, who had said, look, you can't just become part of our leadership team at the children's ministry. So she went back to her and she said, hey, I'm Jessie. I'm the one that you sat down and talked with about 8 months ago. This is my story. And the woman looked at her, and with tears in her eyes, she said, from the day I met you, I never stopped praying for you. And I think that's so beautiful. Like, it's such a beautiful testimony about going beyond politics with an issue like this. There's two things that I think I take out of this story and have stayed with me for so long. And that is, one is that the power of God through his Spirit and Word is so much more than we even sometimes dare to wish for. He can completely change a person. So I've talked to enough people where they've said, oh, my child is starting to do this, or my nephew or niece is starting to do this, or somebody I know who's very close to me is doing this. And no matter what I say to them, it doesn't do anything. It's like words falling on deaf ears or whatever. And then I think of Jesse's story, and I think the Lord can do more than you even dare to imagine he could do. So never give up on your nephew, your niece, or your child, or your brother or sister, or whoever. Keep on praying, because he can do amazing, wonderful things. The second thing that I love about Jesse's story, though, is that we often think, I know I struggle with this. Guys more struggle with this than girls. Guys love to fix things right away, right? So if you go to a guy, so ministers are the exception, if there's any ministers in the room. But you go to a guy generally and say, hey, I'm struggling with my sexual identity. They're going to have a list of advice for you. Okay, do this, this, and this, and it'll be fixed and done. They like to fix things right away, whereas women are generally speaking good listeners, and they want to think about it and talk about it for a really long time. And I'm using gender stereotypes here, but they're stereotypes for a reason. And especially for guys, I think I listened to Jesse's story, and I think this is a good lesson for a guy like me, because when I think of this issue of transgenderism and just how complex it is, the issue of sexual identity and how complex it is, think about the social imaginary and how much it's captured the attention and the imagination of so many people in our culture. And I think, how in the world can I, as an individual, fix any of this? Or if these ideas capture my son or somebody in my church or a family member or whoever, how can I fix it? And Jesse's story tells me is that I can't fix it. There's nothing I can do. But more than that, that the Lord is pleased to work through multiple people in the Christian community to bring about healing and change. That lady at the children's ministry in Jesse's life, that lady, she did what was right and just. She compassionately sat down, listened to Jesse, told her the truth, didn't butter it over, told her the truth. And then Jesse was offended by that and reacted and left. And if I was in that lady's shoes, and maybe she felt this way, I'd be like, I failed. Like, oh no, she walked away. Like if I'd just been more compassionate, or if I just listened longer, or if, I lost a person who could have maybe perhaps been a convert to Christ. My fault. Don't think that way. First of all, it thinks too highly of yourself. And two, you're only finite. God chooses to work through multiple people in the lives of others. And so what did that lady do? She did the only thing she could do. She started praying, and she prayed every single day for the next 8 or 10 or however many months it was until she met Jesse again. That was what she was called to do, and that's the part she played. And then the Lord worked through other people at Le Chemin, at a Pentecostal church, and the Lord worked through other people in Jesse's life. And then he also worked in a divine intervention way where he actually just spoke directly to Jesse through a dream. All of that to say, if we commit our work to the Lord, be faithful in the moment that we have, we can also trust that he's pleased to work through other members of the Christian community. As long as we're faithful, he can, as he chooses and wills, he can bless that. You don't have to fix everybody. Leave the fixing and the healing to him. Just play your part and be pleased to play your part. But don't avoid your part when it presents itself. So these 3 questions, what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful, is something that I think we can think about a little bit in relation to identity, sexuality, and ethics. This has been touched on a bit. I really appreciated last night's lecture and speech where he talked about we've got to move away from the guilt trip and move to the glory trip, because I think he really captured the second and the third point about the goodness and the beauty of God's design for sexuality. Because I think, generally speaking, within the Reformed Christian community anyway, we gravitate towards the first question, what is true? And I think we're learning more and more to really also embrace the answer to the questions, what is good and what is beautiful. But sometimes when you gravitate towards the true, we miss the good and the beautiful. Why is this family formation over here from my last lecture, right, with 7 adults and so on, why is it wrong? Well, we can say, it's not true. It's a falsehood. That's not what the Bible is, how God has designed it. That's not what Scripture teaches about the family. It's that one over there. That's true. And we can really have our doctrine on right, and you need to have your doctrine on right. But then we should also be able to say, why is that a beautiful thing on this side with a mom and a dad and their sexual unity, and how life is brought about through that, compared to this thing over here, which was not good and not beautiful. If we can start talking the language of the good and the beautiful as well, or talk about it more and more, embrace that more and more, we'll give a fuller picture to those that we interact with, our neighbors, our colleagues, and so on, so that they don't just think we're intellectually close-minded, but rather that there's more to what we actually stand for than they originally realized. On pursuing peace and faithful gospel witness, I think a couple of things that we can keep in mind as well is that we have to be convinced that what God prescribes for us, not only is it always going to be true, but it will be for our good, for our flourishing, because he loves us, and it will be beautiful. It'll be a glorious thing. It won't be a monstrosity, and that's true of this whole issue of gender dysphoria. Okay, so we know that from studies that have been done that the majority of children with gender dysphoria actually outgrow it after puberty. The number's upwards of 80%, and some studies suggest it's as high as 96%. That a child that's exhibiting before puberty, they're exhibiting this, that they're acting like or say that they're a girl in a boy's body or vice versa. Just leave them alone through puberty. The vast majority, it'll sort itself out. But of course, now we're not leaving them alone, and we're interfering with that. But then the result is, and this goes to that point about the true, the good, and the beautiful. What's the result? So, attempted suicide rate in the general population is 4.6%. Okay, 4.6% of the general population has at some point in their life attempted suicide. This is not successful necessarily; it's attempted. In the transgender community, that number is 41%. Okay, it'd be 9 times, almost 10 times as high. Now, some people will say, well, that's because of the oppressive, discriminatory structures that are in place, like the traditional family and your Christian morality and your non-acceptance and your exclusivity instead of your inclusivity. And the answer is, well, no, you got to see that number, 41%, is the same in Sweden, which has been pro-transgender for about 30 years. And in San Francisco, which is the most gay-affirming city in the entire world, the number 41% doesn't drop. So it's not about acceptance, it's about something else. There's something else that's wrong. There's an angst there that we're trying to speak into and to address. And in order to get beyond the politics and so on, we have to, I think, be able to show that we have genuine concern and genuine care for people who are presenting as transgender. So our concern, our pastoral concern, our heart concern for our neighbor, for a community, for a coworker, or whoever, I think that the first one is the well-being of vulnerable children. I've kind of hammered on that one in the last lecture as well. And then the second one is the unhindered spread and application of the gospel. And this is one of the things that's troubling to me as well through how things have developed over the last decade or so, is that it's the rules around how we talk about sexuality, identity, sexual ethics, and so on. What they're doing is they're saying there's certain parts of life and there's certain types of people to whom you may not extend the gospel to in all of its depth and all of its beauty and all of its riches. They're saying that so for example, take the conversion therapy law that says you're not allowed to try to convert somebody's sexual orientation. What's behind a law like that is that says, hey, look, you want to talk about the gospel to other religious groups, you can do that. If you want to talk about the gospel as it relates to your own community, you can do that. But if you're talking about the total application of the gospel to every aspect of life, and you're talking to somebody who's part of the LGBTQ plus community, then there's only so far you're allowed to go. You can't apply that gospel to their sexuality, and you can't apply that gospel to the entirety of their life. It hinders the application of the gospel. And the third concern is that issue of parental rights and relationships, parental responsibilities in relationships. And sorry that the lettering, you can't quite read it there. But I hammered away on that one on the last lecture. So I just had a few random thoughts that I wanted to share with you, and then depending on what our timing is, I wouldn't mind just taking a few questions from you, because I'd rather interact with where you're at on this point than try and tell you everything that I think I know. Like, I don't know a ton here. Like, I do politics, so when I was given the title Beyond Politics, I'm like, well, I don't know, man, like, that's all I do. But so these are some random thoughts to a guy that's kind of drawn more to the political and the legal side, trying to think, okay, what do we have to do beyond that? A few thoughts. That's really small. I'm going to switch this for you. I'm going to make these bigger. The first one is that the church needs to be a community. And like, this is really, really, really important. I'm going to just increase this for a second. 18 font. Yeah, that's terrible. Sorry. You need to be able to read it. So a church has to be a community. And this is important because there is a lot of people who are struggling because they don't have a sense of belonging. So I'm going to try this. Maybe this works a little bit better. Not much better, but a little bit better. Church must be a community in a really profound way, okay? The reason why this is so important is because it's community that actually is one of the driving indicators of a person's chosen identity. What do I mean by that? If your child, so this is somewhat of a defensive tactic, but anyway, if your child is involved in church every Sunday and does youth group on Tuesday or Wednesday night and goes to the same Christian school as you worship with on Sunday, so that's Monday through Friday, and maybe works with a Christian employer on Saturday, their identity as a member of that community is much more likely to have staying power. Okay, so community it bequeaths identity in many respects. So for the church to be a community means that a person within that community is more likely to find their identity within the community. Yeah, tracking, right? So whereas if I'm a Christian, but I only go to church once a month when I feel like it, but I have no interaction with the Christian community, that Christian identity, I might still say, I'm a Christian. 2/3 of Canadians actually identify as Christian, okay? But it's not going to be the driving identity behind you. Okay? You're not going to, it's the community that you're most engaged with that's going to be your primary identity. That's why the LGBTQ community actually is so, one of the reasons why they're so powerful is that if somebody doesn't find belonging in a Christian community or another community, they will find belonging in that community. Very much so. They'll be warmly embraced and welcomed in all of their uniqueness. So we need to make sure that we are also that community. That's what we're called to, but that's also what I think we can do even more of. I think we're doing generally okay, but just let's be very intentional about that. We also need to be a church at prayer. Some of you, I know, have been very involved in prayer meetings. They used to be much more common occurrence 100 years ago and 200 years ago and 300 years ago. Certainly during the Reformation, they were used all the time. And I wonder if we need to just do a whole lot more of that, to be a church at prayer, doing spiritual warfare. I guess that's somewhat political, but it's also beyond political to do spiritual warfare. We need to be much more engaged in prayer. And part of that means we also have to have a bit of a mindset change for the Christian community in Canada. And this goes to both points, 1 and 2. We are not the dominant culture anymore, and we haven't been for a while. And we've taken for granted our privileged place in the West for too long. Carl Trueman, in his book, argues that we're much more like the marginal sect in the dominant pluralist society of ancient Rome than we are like the Christian community from 100 years ago. That's a pretty profound change, like that we should actually be preparing ourselves to be like the church in ancient Rome than like the church from 100 years ago. That raises questions for me, like how prepared are we for persecution, real persecution? Losing your income, being marginalized. We're starting to see, and this is not to fearmonger, it's more like get our heads in the game, so to speak. Mob violence is increasing. There's a video floating around from a week ago where a feminist woman, I'm not sure if she's Christian or not, but she was speaking in New Zealand. She didn't even get a chance to speak. She was speaking up for women's rights against the transgender movement, which is erasing women and their uniqueness and their unique vulnerabilities. And the mob of men that descended on her and were trying to assault her and attack her was absolutely terrifying. You could see pictures of this woman, the look on her face is sheer terror. And there hasn't been much said about it, simply because this woman is on the wrong side of history, apparently. So there is a lot of violence out there. Are we ready to engage in spiritual warfare, and are we ready to also then accept some persecution? Another random thought is, and this has also been hammered away on by Reverend Mordyke, which I've really appreciated in his speech this morning. We have to have a consistent sexual ethic. That's essential. Hypocrisy can be sniffed out a mile away. And I think that for some perhaps churches or for some Christians perhaps, that this hasn't been consistent, right? I think I heard this stat somewhere. I can't remember if it was at this conference or just talking with somebody else this week, but that there's this sense that, if you're engaged in heterosexual sin, well, you're 95% Christian with this 5% issue that you got to fix. But if you're engaged in homosexual sin, you're 95% not Christian, maybe 5% Christian, and the other 95% you got to really fix. And it's like sexual sin is sexual sin, and we need to deal with it all. And so we can't have, men sleeping around as long as it's, straight sex instead of homosexual sex, or men or women looking at pornography, for example, and saying, well, guys are going to be guys. We have to have a consistent sexual ethic and take this seriously across the board. Hypocrisy can be sniffed out, and it stinks to high heaven. Another random thought is that we need to be bilingual. What I mean by this is not that because we're Canadian we should be able to speak en français et en anglais, English and French, but rather we need to be able to speak the language of the church, the language of Scripture and so on, and be absolutely convicted of its truths, but be able to translate it into a language that's understood by someone who is unchurched. Most of the people that you're going to engage in, even if they identify as Christian, don't understand some of the language of our rich Christian tradition or the language of the Bible. And so this one's a tough one. It's a hard one. And again, I welcome your thoughts and engagement on this one. But are there ways that we can communicate the truths of God's world as He's created it, the truths about what it means to be human, made in the image of God? Can we communicate the truth of anthropology in a way that resonates with someone who doesn't yet know God, doesn't yet know Jesus Christ, doesn't yet know or is not really familiar with what Scripture teaches? I think that takes quite a bit of effort to do, and the best way to do that is by listening more and talking less. Chatting with Pastor Lipsy over lunch, and Pastor Lipsy mentioned that he has or is planning to offer a free cup of coffee or drink with anyone who wants to sit down and just talk through an issue like this. What does it mean to be human? What is my identity? What does it mean to have a sexual ethic, or what should sexual ethics look like? Or and to have a genuine dialogue back and forth. I love that idea. A challenge in that kind of conversation, it takes effort on our part to be able to sit down, not only just to sit down and have that conversation, but then also to, as you're communicating, how do you not become ships passing in that night? You're actually resonating with each other. You're connecting. The words that are coming out of your mouth are landing in a way that they're like, okay, yes, I think now I understand what you're saying. That takes a lot of effort and a lot of thought. Yes. Related to that then, but also somewhat random, is relationship first, policy second. We use that phrase a lot in the work that we do at ARPA Canada in politics when you're talking about things like lobbying and so on. But I think that is true in evangelism and in reaching other people as well. Relationship first, policy second. In other words, if you're just going to shove the policy down somebody's throat, you're not going to get very far at all. But if you're willing to build a relationship with a fellow image bearer of God, have a coffee with them, get to know them as a neighbor or a colleague, show genuine concern about them as a person, not simply as a object to whom you need to somehow get them into the pew so that your work with them is done, but rather you're genuinely interested in relationship, then the policy can flow from that, can come through after that. So that would be things like talking about doctrine and identity and moral ethics and so on. To show that you care, it's to talk about not just what is true, but also what is good, what is beautiful, what is going to cause and contribute to human flourishing. Another thing that perhaps sounds political, and I don't mean it to, I mean it definitely has a political edge to it, but it doesn't have to be, is building alliances with people who are not Christian. Again, we're a minority now, and so I think we can also think like a minority. And building alliances does not mean compromising on the truth at all. But there are other groups out there that share the same kind of concerns that we are, and they're not necessarily Christian. So there are a lot of feminist groups, for example, that are very concerned about what the transgender revolution, for example, means for women's interests, protecting their private spaces, for example, or their sex-segregated sports or whatever. I've done some work, some advocacy in court, for example, on the prostitution question. And interestingly, feminists are split 50-50 on the question of prostitution. Some feminists think this is liberating for women and empowering for women, and other women, I think rightly, feminists say, no, this is the objectification of women and it's the disempowering of women. And so those feminists, they're not all Christian, but they really appreciate the fact that Christian men and women are standing up for women across the country against prostitution and the objectification of women. Which shouldn't be surprising, because actually if you think about the early church, the population of the early church was mainly populated by women and slaves, because Christianity was a gospel that actually for them lifted them out of subjugation in a really big way. There's certainly a lot of men in the Christian church as well, but the earliest converts that found incredible acceptance in the church were women and slaves. Then also with children's rights advocates as well. They also, I think, are seeing some of the abuses of the changes in the law. And again, grudgingly sometimes they're like, oh, those Christians, maybe they're onto something. And we can work together. And through those relationships, professional relationships or whatever, we can also then build and create momentum to also open up about the gospel with them. And then two more for you. The seventh one is we have to be ready to pick up all the broken pieces. Okay, so I told you Jesse's story. I told you Kelsey's story in my first lecture. The reality is that there are going to be thousands of people who have been mutilated or broken by this bad ideology. And it's the calling for the church to come in and not say, well, we told you so. Maybe a little bit of that, but that shouldn't be our primary message. Rather, it's we were expecting this fallout, and we're here to pick up the pieces for you. There's so many broken people. And so that's like there too. Should we have conversations perhaps as churches to say, okay, as these broken, wounded people with all kinds of baggage, we all have baggage, but all kinds of baggage, what can we do as churches to have somebody who, a woman who's got a scarred body is missing her breasts, and she's a wounded person. Do we have room for a person like that here? I think we do, absolutely. Or a man who's had his genitals removed, his penis has been surgically removed. Can you welcome a person like that? It's more. It's not that hard, and yet at the same time it can be somewhat abrupt when you're faced with it. I'll give you an example. A couple of years ago, when we were going through the adoption process for our daughter, at earliest stages, then she would still have visits with her birth mom 4 times a week. And so for a couple of those visits, the Children's Aid Society would pick up our daughter, who was not our daughter at the time, but was living with us. They'd pick her up and bring her to an appointment at the CAS with her birth mom. And so one of those drivers, one of the car drivers who would come pick up Jasmine, we had to wait at our house until the birth mom called in to the or arrived at CAS, because she'd often miss her appointment, right? So to spare us the hassle of going to the appointment and back, and no mom was there, the birth mom had to go there, call in, and then we'd send Jasmine off. Okay, so I'm waiting around with the driver on the front lawn, and she's got this big scar on his arm. And so I said to him, do you mind if I ask what's that scar from? Did you burn yourself or something? And this person said, no, that's how they made my penis. And I was like, okay. Say, oh yeah, no, I used to be a woman, but I've been transitioning. Like, this person looked very much like a man to me, right? Facial hair and everything else. It's like, but I went down to Texas, and the surgeon there took this big chunk of flesh off my forearm, and that's how they made my penis. It doesn't really work very well, though. Like, it takes me like half an hour to pee, and it hurts like used an expletive. And I just thought, wow, okay, I can try and have a conversation with this person. But like somebody who's hurting, who's been mutilated, has this scar here, and the plumbing's not working, causing a lot of pain for this person. And yeah, my heart just broke for this individual standing there. I'm like, what have they done to you? What kind of ideas have they told you? What lies have they told you that they would do this to you? So we have to be ready for a person like that to say, come on in here, and maybe you can find healing here as well. And then the last thought I had here was totally unrelated, well, not totally unrelated, somewhat unrelated from the rest, somewhat random thought. But it's better to enter heaven with no cell phone. That's a play on when Jesus said it's better to enter heaven with one eye, or better to enter heaven with one arm or one hand. And one thing that I've been convicted of a lot in the last 10 years is, and this ties actually back up to item number 1 about the church being a community, is the amount of change that has happened, and especially in the last 10 years, has accelerated for various reasons. But one of the reasons that it's accelerated is that community in the natural way, through face-to-face interaction with fellow human beings, is nearly, has dropped off in a big way. But community online has exploded. And so it's not true relationship, but there's a sense of community online. And children from very young ages are being exposed to ideas that are very, very, very harmful ideas. So, for example, the whole transgender phenomenon. If you looked at a graph of how many people are transitioning and who's transitioning, the numbers have completely gone out of whack in just the last 15 years. So if you go back in time, 15 years ago, gender dysphoria presented in men more often than women by a factor of 3 to 1. Okay, so if somebody presents with gender dysphoria, they feel like they're the wrong sex in the wrong body or whatever. 3 times out of 4, it was a man who identified that way. Today, just 15 years later, it's 9 times out of 10 female that says, I'm a woman trapped in a male body. I'm a man trapped in a woman's body. It's flipped, it's switched genders and then multiplied. That can only be explained, really, credibly, because of the online communities of females who say they're men trapped in girls' bodies and that are doing transitions to the opposite sex en masse. Okay, so there's been some studies done on this. Lisa Littman, who's not a Christian, I don't think, but she's from one of the Ivy League schools in the United States, has tracked this for young women. It's a social contagion. It's like anorexia, right? So with anorexia, if one person in a high school has anorexia, there's more likely to be another person who gets anorexia in the same high school than if there's no one there at all. It's socially contagious. Well, that's so much more true of gender dysphoria. It's socially contagious. And Lisa Littman has exposed this phenomenon. And it's contagious particularly through online communities. So if you're a Christian, it's getting to the point now where I'm feeling more and more confident in saying that you are a neglectful parent if you do not filter what your children are exposed to online. Like, we can't have this happen anymore. True community has to be real community, in-person community. It can't be meeting some person over a game, like an online game who's in Texas or whatever, or meeting up with some people that think the same way as you about some sexual ethic online that you've never met in person. That's not community. And if that means your child doesn't get a cell phone until after all the cool kids get their cell phone, then so be it. It's better to enter heaven without a cell phone. I was going to end with this thought from Nancy Pearcey in her book, Love Thy Body, which if you haven't read it, read it. It's really good if you have time. And in this book, she says this, and it stayed with me for a very long time. As we work through controversial moral issues, it is crucial to bear in mind the main goal. It is not, first of all, to persuade people to change their behavior. It is to tear down barriers to becoming Christian. No matter who we are addressing or what moral issue the person is struggling with, their first need is to hear the gospel and experience the love of God. I love that. I think that's absolutely true. Like, if we're focused exclusively on behavior, we're not going to break down those barriers and let this individual that we're engaging with meet their Savior. Shall I end there? That is where that's my last slide. So yeah, good. Thank you.
thank you again, Andre. So we have our next session starting at 3:45, so we have a little bit of time. Go outside, maybe grab a snack, and then come right back in if you can, because we want to get the next session underway on a timely manner. Thank you.